The global stage finds itself thrust into a state of profound unease. The chilling proclamation by the Islamic State group claiming responsibility for a brazen assault on a vibrant concert hall in Moscow sends shockwaves rippling across continents, with the toll of human lives exceeding 100 and a city grappling with the raw aftermath of terror. A haunting pall of uncertainty blankets the landscape. Yet with this chaos, a labyrinth tapestry of political intrigue unfurls its tangled threads. From the Kremlin's swift indictments to the enigmatic maneuvers of global dignitaries, each twist in this narrative unfurls deeper layers of geopolitical complexity. As the dust settles over Moscow, the clench of security tightens and suspicion soar to unprecedented heights. With accusations hurled and alliances tested, the repercussions of this unspeakable tragedy echo far beyond the confines of Russia's borders. And now, as the eyes of the world fixate upon the unfolding drama, the stage is set for a high-stakes diplomatic spectacle. From the hallowed halls of Washington to the hushed chambers of the United Nations, from the embattled streets of Kyiv to the alleys of Gaza, the resonance of this calamity reverberates within the corridors of power worldwide. Today, we are honored to be graced by the presence of a titan in the realm of public service, a luminary whose unwavering commitment to safeguarding our nation's interests has illuminated the path forward through the darkest of times. None other than Secretary Leon Edward Panetta, former Secretary of Defense, former Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, joins us today. Secretary Panetta's indelible mark on history spans from his instrumental role in brokering pivotal deals with congressional Republicans during his tenure as Director of Management and Budget for President Bill Clinton, to his esteemed service in the Iraq Study Group, an august think tank tasked by Congress to dissect the multifaceted political, economic, and security quagmire in post-invasion Iraq. Moreover, Secretary Panetta's leadership was underscored by his oversight of clandestine operations to the demise of Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the September 11th terrorist attacks on American soil. In the annals of our nation's history, Secretary Panetta's name is etched in bold letters, a testament to his unyielding dedication to the highest ideals of public service. Join us today as we delve into the wisdom, the insights of this distinguished statesman navigating through the tempestuous waters of the contemporary geopolitics with this unparalleled guidance. Thank you so much, Secretary Panetta, for being a part of the Political Mic today.
Mike, it's good to be with you, and it's good to have the opportunity to kind of talk about this very dangerous world that we're all a part of.
In the wake of the devastating attack on the concert hall in Moscow, Mr. Secretary, there's been speculation about the Islamic State group's motives for targeting Russia at this time. What strategic considerations might have influenced their decision to carry out such a brazen assault on Russian soil?
Well, Mike, we're talking about terrorists, and we're familiar with terrorism going back to 9/11 and what Al-Qaeda did to our country. Their basic approach is to instill fear in people, and to do that by killing innocent men, women, and children. That's what terrorists do. And that's what ISIS just did in Moscow. They went in, 4 gunmen, and basically killed innocent men and women who were involved in that concert in the middle of Moscow. So I don't think we have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out why, because they are members of a terrorist group called ISIS, and ISIS's commitment is to basically go out and try to destroy their enemies, whether it's Russia, whether it's the United States, whether it's Europe, whether it's Western countries. And that's why, I've always said that terrorism still remains a very real threat for the United States and something we've got to pay attention to.
Mr. Secretary, the Russian government has faced criticism for its handling of security measures leading up to the attack, particularly given the tightened surveillance on Kremlin critics. How do you assess the effectiveness of Russia's counterterrorism efforts in light of this tragedy?
Well, I don't think there's any question that it weakens Putin's image as somebody who can provide for the security of the Russian people. It's particularly frustrating that Russia was advised by our intelligence sources in the United States, was advised that there was a threat, a real threat, that something like this would happen. And we provided that information to the Russians not just once, but twice. and it was ignored. I think the comment by Putin was that this was just an effort at misinformation by the United States. So he didn't pay attention to it. And the result was that not only did they not prepare for this kind of attack, but they assumed that it was not something that would ever happen. And that's an indication that the preparation of a country in order to provide for its security has to be constantly vigilant and constantly prepared to deal not only with the intelligence of threats, but with the threat of attacks themselves. So this is not only a failing in terms of their security, it's a failing in terms of their intelligence, and it's a failing in terms of their leadership in failing to recognize the threat that was out there.
In your book, Mr. Secretary, Worthy Fights, you highlight the importance of international cooperation in combating terrorism. With Russia grappling with this devastating attack, how do you assess the effectiveness of current diplomatic efforts in fostering collaboration among nations to address transnational security threats?
Well, unfortunately, we're living at a time when there is a larger conflict going on between autocracies like Russia and China, North Korea, Iran, and terrorists whose principal goal is to try to undermine democracies in the world. Putin went in, tried to destroy democracy in Ukraine. The Hamas terrorists went in and tried to destroy democracy in Israel. And China is threatening to go after democracy in Taiwan. So the real effort now, I think, that's required by this dangerous world we live in, and the threat that autocrats are going to try to continue to undermine democracy, is that it is absolutely critical for the United States as a world leader to help to build and strengthen alliances throughout the world. It was important that the United States and NATO unified in saying to Putin that if he invades, that they would do everything necessary to help Ukraine, that they would apply sanctions against Russia, and that they would reinforce NATO. And they've done exactly that. I believe the challenge for the United States is going to be to build alliances elsewhere that can deal with threats in that area. For example, in the Middle East, I think it's important for us to build strong alliances with moderate Arab countries, with Israel, in order to confront both Iran and terrorism in that part of the world. I think it's important in Asia to build strong alliances in order to confront China and the threat from China. And we do. We've got a strong alliance with South Korea. We've got a strong alliance with Japan. We've got a strong alliance with Australia, with India, and with other Asian countries in order to try to confront China. I think the ability of the United States as a world leader to build those kinds of alliances, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in China, whether it's in Latin and Central America, or whether it's in Africa, I think that is a fundamental key to our ability to provide security in the 21st century.
The recent UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas conflict took place. What implications do you foresee for U.S.-Israeli relations, especially considering Israel's cancellation of its officials' visit to Washington, D.C.?
It's obviously a very difficult situation, not only in terms of confronting the threats that Israel has to deal with from Hamas, but it's a difficult situation in terms of trying to determine what is the next chapter here in the Middle East that can try to make sure that what Hamas did will never happen again. And, while the Israelis have obviously gone to war against Hamas to defend themselves, and everybody understands why with the attack that took place in October, there is a concern now really on two fronts. Number one, how does this war ultimately resolve itself? And clearly, the ability to go after the leadership of Hamas that was involved in that attack is very important for Israel and very frankly important for the world. And so one of the questions that Israel's confronting and the rest of the world is, how does Israel ultimately target the leadership of Hamas and be able to provide that sense that Israel has in fact gone after those who were involved in the October 7th attack? They've made some progress against Hamas, no question about it, in Gaza. Does it mean that they should now invade Rafah and create even more civilian deaths, which we know is a number that is involved in the thousands right now of those innocent people that have been impacted? Should they do that, or should they have more precise targeting, going after the targets that need to be gone after? And it's basically a counterterrorism operation. It's what I was involved in going after Al-Qaeda. You do intelligence, you target those who are involved, and you go after them. That ultimately has to be what Israel does. But even more important is the issue of the next chapter. What now happens? Let's assume Israel ultimately goes after Hamas, kills the rest of those leaders involved. What then? What then? And that, is an issue that Israel has kind of, at least Netanyahu, has been trying to avoid an answer as to what happens next. And if we are going to ultimately find peace in the Middle East, there is no question that we have to develop a state for Palestine, for the Palestinians. And that means that we're going to have to work with moderate Arab countries. We're going to have to work with Israel to try to develop the leadership that's necessary in order to provide the support system that can sustain a state, number one. And two, that we need to work out the security issues to make clear to Israel that a Palestinian state will not be a threat to the survival of Israel. Those are all big challenges. But frankly, we ought to be working on that now in order to try to make sure that whatever happened on October 7th, A, is not repeated, but B, that steps are taken to provide for better peace in the Middle East.
There are young people across the country, Mr. Secretary, who have made it a purpose to call for a ceasefire. There are activists who are actively campaigning for a ceasefire. There are those in Michigan who voted uncommitted because they're dissatisfied with the current administration's policy as it pertains to Gaza. What is your response to those young people? Young people usually on the cusp of change and protest. You go back to Vietnam and protests that happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. You fast forward to the war on terror. There were young people protesting in those days as well. And now here we are, again, young people protesting for a ceasefire. What is your response to them? And what is your response to the cynic out there who may say, my vote wouldn't matter because no matter what, I wouldn't get the specific policy I want as it pertains to the Israel-Hamas conflict? In light of the fact that former President Trump recently met with the Hungarian president right after getting to be the presumptive nominee of his respective political party.
Well, that's an issue we deal with here at the Panetta Institute, because one of the things we try to do here is to encourage a new generation of young people to understand that they have a responsibility to our democracy and to its future. They can't just walk away from it. They can't just not be involved. The way we sustain our democracy and strengthen it is by having a younger and newer generation of leaders embrace what has to be done in our democracy in order to live up to our values. And that's why I think young people need to understand that they can make a difference. They can make a difference if they're active, if they're involved, if they really care about the future. Now, none of these issues is easy, obviously. But I think what young people need to do is to basically say, what is the best approach here in terms of trying to ensure that there is a better future in the Middle East? And you can't just take a position, well, all we need is an immediate ceasefire, and somehow that's going to solve the problem. It's not. It's not. If we had an immediate ceasefire right now, The problem would be that Hamas would return, that Israel would be vulnerable again to another attack from Hamas, and peace would not be restored in the Middle East. I think what's needed now is to put in place certainly a ceasefire. I agree with that. We need to put in place a ceasefire and try to at least get a temporary ceasefire agreed to by the parties, which has a better chance. By the way, you're not going to get a ceasefire because the only way you get a ceasefire is if Hamas and Israel agree. Right. And they're not going to agree to a permanent ceasefire right now. That's just the reality. So what is needed now is a long, temporary ceasefire, the exchange of hostages so that we try to get the hostages returned. And thirdly, humanitarian aid provided to those that have been impacted by this war. All of those steps need to be taken now. And what that will give us, hopefully, is a basis on which ultimately to achieve a more permanent ceasefire that can end the fighting in that part of the world, but also establish the foundation for more permanent peace. How do we build a Palestinian state? How do we build the security that's important in that part of the world? How do we make sure that we are protected against terrorists, not just Hamas, but Hezbollah, as well as ISIS, as well as Al-Qaeda? There are a number of terrorist groups that we have to protect against. How do we unify the world? How do we build the alliances necessary in order to ultimately deliver the kind of peace that all of us want in the Middle East and elsewhere? That is the responsibility of all of us, of young people, of leaders that are elected leaders who are there today. Look, the one thing I learned, and I'm the son of immigrants. My parents were immigrants who came to this country. The one thing I learned is that if you really get involved in our democracy and really fight for what you believe in, you can make a difference. You can make a difference. That's the great hope of a democracy. Yep. Is that ultimately if people can get together, work together, put pressure on those who are elected, put pressure on the political system, that ultimately you can make a difference. I can't stress that enough. But you can't just pound your shoe on the table. You've got to make sure that you are trying to put together the kind of coalitions and positions on issues that ultimately will be embraced by those who are in a position to really make a difference as to what happens in our democracy.
Well, Secretary Panetta, thank you so much for the time that you spent. I have to admit, after watching Zero Dark 30, I was a little intimidated after seeing James Gandolfini's portrayal of you, but you're much kinder and nicer in person. So thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, I'll just end by telling you, Gandolfini called me once. He sent me a note and said, "You probably don't like the way I played you in the movie, but I want you to know I have a lot of admiration for you." And I called him and said, "No, look," I said, "it was a great movie. I'm glad they picked an Italian to play me, please understand that I think parts of that movie were really pretty good in terms of portraying what happened." And he said, but there was one problem. They kept making me use 4-letter words. And I said, that's the one thing you got right.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much. With that being said, that's going to conclude episode 129 of the Political Mike podcast. Thank you all for tuning in.